Please be seated.
Thank you, Your Honour. Today we have three witnesses. Baroness Hollins is by video link from London. Each are members of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. And perhaps if I can give a short introduction to that commission before Baroness Hollins is sworn in, Your Honour.
Well, perhaps we might get her sworn so she can sit down.
I think she's already said.
Baroness, you can hear us?
I can hear you.
Yes. You have a Bible there?
I do.
Yes. Would you take that in your hand, please, and repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
The evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
The evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. You're welcome to sit now.
And does Your Honour wish to...
Yeah, I think we might... Both of you, yes, oath on the Bible, yes. Would you together repeat after me? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
That the evidence I shall give to this Royal Commission.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat.
Thank you, Your Honour. In March 2014, Pope Francis established the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. The Pope appointed Cardinal Sean O'Malley, the Archbishop of Boston, as President of the Pontifical Commission. The Commission's statutes describe its role as a purely advisory body at the service of the Pope for the purposes of promoting local responsibility in the particular churches for the protection of all minors and vulnerable adults. The statutes also describe the composition of the Pontifical Commission as a maximum of 18 members and a president appointed by the Pope for a period of 3 years. The Commission initially comprised 9 members. In December 2014, Pope Francis added 8 members, bringing a total of 17 members, with 16 currently being active. There are 8 women and 9 men, both clerical and lay, on the Commission, and members come from a variety of countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, Britain, Colombia, New Zealand and others. The group includes 2 survivors of child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. As Your Honour and Commissioners might recall, Ms McCormack was scheduled to give evidence in the first week of the hearing, and unfortunately she was unwell but has recovered sufficiently to join us today, and we're very grateful for Baroness Hollins and Mr Kilgallen to also join us today. So perhaps if I can start with you, Baroness.
Yes.
You've been a member of the Commission for the Protection of Minors since 2014.
Ms Vanessa, I think we need a name.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Your full name, Baroness?
It's Sheila Hollins. My full title is Professor Sheila the Baroness Hollins.
Thank you. And you've been a member of the Papal Commission for the Protection of Minors since 2014?
Yes, that's right.
And you've done a deal of work in relation to the protection of minors for most of your working life?
Yes, I've been a clinical psychiatrist for 30 years and a psychotherapist with victims and perpetrators of abuse, and was involved in identifying abused children and adults in the 1980s. My particular focus has been on children and adults with intellectual disabilities. That's been my particular focus for probably 22 of those years. I'm also the chair of the Scientific Advisory Group for the Centre for Child Protection at the Gregorian University in Rome. And another aspect of my curriculum vitae is that I was a researcher working... I ran a psychotherapy group for people with intellectual disabilities who'd been abused or had abused others, which was a psychotherapy treatment group, which actually ran for 18 years altogether, and involved quite a lot of clinical research and teaching on the subject.
Thank you. You provided to us a statement responding to various questions that the Royal Commission set out. That's right. And you have a copy of that with you, Baroness?
I do.
Your Honour, that appears behind tab 43 of the hearing bundle. Now, coming back to... Do you have it with you, Baroness? Yes.
Yes, I mean, mine I printed off myself this morning, all of the papers, so they may not be in the same order as yours.
Thank you. How was it that you came to be appointed a member of the Commission?
I was asked by the Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who was the cardinal he's now emeritus cardinal in England and Wales, if I would accompany him to Ireland as part of a Vatican visitation to the Catholic Church in Ireland, in response to concerns about the way in which the response of the Irish Church was taking place. I spent 3 weeks with Cardinal Cormac in Ireland, and he was very keen that a woman who had some clinical knowledge and experience of victims and survivors of sexual abuse, not necessarily within the church, but who would be able to support him in listening to the people that he was planning to meet in Ireland. And we basically met, I would say, hundreds of people, including many victim survivors, their families, priests and religious. And we had several meetings with the bishops in Ireland as well. Our particular visitation was one of 5, the visitation which he was leading, and I was accompanying him in the Diocese of Armagh, and involved in assisting him with preparing his report at the end of that. And it was after that that I was asked if I would speak at a conference in Rome at the Gregorian University about the effect on children, the long-lasting effect on victims of abuse. My response to that invitation, after discussing it with the person who invited me, was to say that I would be willing to do that, but only if they would also invite a victim survivor to accompany me. And after some considerable discussion, it was agreed that I should identify somebody who would be willing to come with me so that we could prepare a joint submission, a joint presentation. And we did that. And it was I think it was a very important event, because the conference had been organised for bishops from around the world, bishops and religious superiors from around the world. All the bishops' conferences were asked to send a representative. And I think there were probably about 230 people there. And there were a lot of concerns about having a victim survivor present and speaking to priests, and feeling that this would be too difficult. But anyway, I asked Mari Collins from Dublin to accompany me, and we spent quite a bit of time. I didn't know her before, but I did some research to find out who would be a very good voice to really be the leading voice in our presentation. And she had a remarkable impact on the bishops who were there. And I think one of the people who'd been involved at that time was Monsignor Scicluna, who is now the bishop in Malta. But for 10 years he was the promoter of justice in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And he had done some very, very good work to really try to speed up the Vatican's response. And it was after that that I began to be contacted by Monsignor Oliver, who is now the Secretary of the Pontifical Commission, to discuss with me the idea that there might be a Pontifical Commission, and to talk to me about, the sorts of things which might be important. And so that's basically how I came, and also how Maury Collins came to be a member, because of our presentation at that event.
What is the purpose of the commission, Baroness?
Well, it is advisory to the Holy Father, and the idea is that we should advise him on the policies and the educational programmes that will try to ensure that children and vulnerable adults throughout the world, wherever the Catholic Church is working, that those policies and educational programmes will be in place to make the Church a safer place. And it was for us to recommend whatever policies, whatever we felt needed to change, needed to take place, in order that the Church would be more responsive and better able to support people who have been abused, as well as to prevent it.
Do you, that is the members of the Commission, advise the Pope directly, or is there some intermediate group of people or individual within the Vatican to whom you deal?
We advise the Holy Father directly through the President, Cardinal O'Malley, who meets with him regularly. We've all had the opportunity to meet the Pope, Pope Francis. We believe that he is going to be coming to one of our meetings this year, but we don't know the details of that yet. But we normally, at the end of a meeting, have decided and prepared proposals. And when our proposals are ready, they go to the Holy Father directly through our President.
Is the work of the Commission primarily through its working groups?
Yes, I would say that. Well, the work of the Commission is the working. We've been trying to. We spent some time. I mean, in your introduction, you talked about the statutes having been prepared in advance. That was the implication. It's not quite true. There was a lot of work discussing the statutes during the first year before the Commission was fully up and running, and we identified the nature and purpose of our work, and identified the areas that we wanted to work on. And the areas that we were keen to work on were too many. There were too many areas, not just in a sense, we came up with a lot of quite small issues, which became quite exhausting to work on. So we rationalised in the second year, when the full Commission was there, to have 6 working groups. And it's become much more efficient and effective, I think, because we've been working in working groups which, where any proposals are developed and then taken to the plenary meeting, where they can then be discussed and debated and agreed by the full Commission. So the idea is that they would be prepared in advance of the meeting and then brought to the whole Commission to formalise. And when they've been voted on, they can then go to the Holy Father. But they need to be well worked up and prepared before that can happen.
What do you see as the most significant area of work of the Commission?
Personally, I think healing and care. Well, I think it's all important. It's all really important. But I personally, and it's because of my work as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, I personally think that healing and care for victims and survivors is of critical importance. And one of the reasons I say that is because, in fact, if we are able to accompany, to be with victim survivors and support them in all aspects of their recovery and their lives, it's actually going to make it easier, I think, also to protect children in the future. because there will be better understanding through having had the courage to actually understand and hear what survivors have to say.
And are you doing research work in that area?
We don't. Are we doing research? We're not doing research. Unlike the Royal Commission, which has commissioned research, I wouldn't call it research. I'm an academic. We have met with people who've advised us. We've read a lot. We've considered very carefully from what we've read and what we've heard what we think the important issues are.
What are those important issues?
Well, for example, one of the most important things is that that there is some transparency and openness, and that people are treated with respect and listened to. But one of the typical responses of bishops when somebody does make an allegation, and of course, remember that most people make allegations very late. I think the average, it depends where you are and so on, but it might be as many as 30 years before somebody actually makes an allegation or has the courage to do so. And when they do, it's often as a result of hearing about another case. And this happened when I was in Ireland. I met many people who were getting on with their lives, had managed, perhaps not even told their wife about it or their husband about it. And then something happened, something came out of the news, and they would break down. And so here's somebody with a breakdown, and perhaps themselves doesn't understand why they're actually not coping up, or why they've started having emotional difficulties. And it's quite a crisis in people's lives, and then not to be believed is really, really difficult. But then what often seems to happen is that there's the legal issues around compensation, around deciding whether or not the allegation is a true allegation. There are issues around the possibility that the person who abused them is no longer alive. In some countries, there's the statute of limitations, which says that 30 years is too long. All of those things. Counselling, which is offered, and in some countries, there is quite sophisticated counselling and therapy available for survivors. In some countries, there is not. The provision of mental health services in many countries is very, very scarce. And then finally, the thing which is often overlooked is the spiritual needs of the survivor. And a number of people have said to me that they haven't lost their faith in God, but they find it very difficult to go into a church or to go to a service in a church where there's a priest officiating, particularly if nobody has helped them to try to make sense of the spiritual aspects of their experience and their attempt to come to terms with and to live with what's happened for them. And so many people will have stopped going to church because they find it too painful to be in church.
With the learnings you've described from the work in the area of healing and care, what recommendations or advice have you given to Pope Francis in this area?
Well, one of the recommendations is that it's very important that when a survivor writes a letter, that there should be a response. That seems fundamental, that if somebody writes a letter, that there should be a response. And it seems that this is a very hard thing for many church leaders to do.
It sounds very simple, Baroness. Why is it so hard?
Yeah.
Do you know, I don't think it's... I think... I'm a psychiatrist. I've been president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I've been involved in teaching psychiatrists. Psychiatrists find it hard as well. It's really interesting how difficult it is to get people to be able to allow the reality of abuse and the painfulness of abuse actually to be present in their consciousness. And I think, to me, from a psychological perspective, I see it almost as a denial of what's going on and what it means. And it takes quite a lot of courage for people to actually face up to the reality of abuse and to understand that this is real, that this pain won't go away, that you can't just listen once, you have to listen and keep on listening and keep on being there, because this is long-term suffering that many people experience. And I think it's just where people haven't had the sort of psychological development which will allow them to experience that kind of human emotional pain, that somehow acknowledging it it's a form of defence, really. And I can, from a psychiatric point of view, I can understand it. And I've seen it amongst many different professional groups. I've seen it in the church, but I've also seen it, I'm ashamed to say, within my own profession.
When you say...
So I see it as a denial.
Thank you. When you say people haven't had that sort of psychological development, when speaking within the church, are you referring primarily to bishops or those parish priests and others who might receive complaints?
I think the psychological development, within the preparation and the formation of priests, and this would be true also, although slightly different for people within religious communities, but there are 4 pillars of formation. One of them is human development. And I think it's the aspect of human formation which in many seminaries has changed, and in recent years has changed to make it a much more substantial and seriously taught part of their curriculum. But in some it is not, and in the past it was certainly not a primary focus for the development. And I do see that failure to support men who are coming into the seminaries to study to become a priest, that they've often not been enabled and encouraged and supported to develop that aspect of themselves, that emotional maturity and emotional understanding, which I think is a very essential part of the pastoral ministry. And that's going to go right the way through, at all levels of the priesthood and of bishops. And there are some exceptional bishops who do have that emotional intelligence, but I'm afraid there are also some who haven't been encouraged and enabled to develop that emotional side of themselves.
Have you had any recent involvement with seminaries or the way in which formation occurs now to tell us whether you think it's changed sufficiently?
I have. I think that's an issue which is just going to be incredibly local, and it's going to be culturally affected as well. So I think in some countries there have been huge changes, and I think I haven't had recent. I haven't visited a seminary for 3 years, I don't think, but I have spoken to the rectors of some seminaries, and they speak positively about the changes they're implementing. That's in the UK, and I don't know what's happening in Australia, and I don't know what's happening in African countries, for example. And this is one of the issues that the Pontifical Commission is dealing with, which is that we're concerned with the worldwide church and the different cultural issues and the different stage of understanding of the seriousness of child abuse within institutions.
One issue that has arisen here, Baroness, is when overseas trained priests come to Australia, how one ensures that there is a process of, for want of a better word, enculturation, so that those priests understand the norms and values of this society in relation to child protection. Is that the sort of thing you're referring to?
Yes.
Now, you indicated to respond to a letter was one of the pieces of advice or recommendations you made to the Pope. Are there any others in relation to this area of healing and care?
Well, one of the things that we did was to ask him if he would meet survivors, and he responded and agreed to meet 6 survivors, because we felt that this would encourage other church leaders to do the same. And so over one weekend we invited 6 survivors from 3 different countries to come, and they all had an opportunity to spend as much time with the Holy Father as they wanted. They were the ones who ended the conversation. And he spent about 3 hours meeting, a little over 3 hours, I think, meeting the 6 survivors. And they were all very touched and moved by what he said and how he was. And he was very, very moved by their experience. And I think, and our hope was and is that when he does visit other countries, that he would also be able to do the same when he does visit. And so we certainly in our first year recommended to him that it would be very helpful and very encouraging if he was able to do that when he visits. What else have we recommended from that group? I'm not a member of the Healing and Care group now. I was for the first period, but I've been focusing my work in another area, although I have just rejoined that group. What else have we recommended? I'm not sure. Bill or Kath may be able to help me there.
Thank you. We'll come to them, and I'm sure they've made a note of that. Is education's a particular interest of yours as well, is it not?
Well, Kath McCormack is the leader of the education group, but yes, education is an area of interest of mine, particularly, and one of the areas that I am involved in is the Centre for Child Protection at the Gregorian University, which has been has developed an education program, which is an e-learning course, which, and I can't tell you right now how many students there are, but or how many countries it's in, but it's been growing hugely. And the idea of this e-learning program is that it helps prepare pastoral workers and church leaders in different cultures and different continents. And all continents are now involved in that program. And the Gregorian University also, and it's led by the head of the unit is Father Hans Zollner, a Jesuit, who's also a member of the Pontifical Commission. And so one of the other things that we've been doing is setting up a diploma course. And it's in its second year now, and there are now 20 students from, I think, 4 continents who are attending this 2-semester diploma with the aim of trying to develop the leaders for those countries who will be able to take forward education programs themselves. And this work, although it's not part of the Pontifical Commission, it's in response to the Pontifical Commission. And there are a number of other kind of initiatives like that, which I think are developing in different parts of the world in response to the education work that the Pontifical Commission has been encouraging.
The Commission's also published guidelines.
That's right.
And the purpose of... I'm sorry, Baroness.
Well, Bill Kilgallen is the leader of that working group and is best placed to talk about the guidelines.
Thank you. In your document you prepared for the Royal Commission, you expressed some views in relation to the factors that may have contributed to the occurrence of child sexual abuse in Catholic institutions or affected the response of those institutions. Can you tell us what you consider in relation to those factors that may have contributed?
So which question are you referring to here?
It's on page 3 of your document, Baroness. Do you have that?
Yes. So which was the question you wanted? Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Certainly. You see the question that's bolded at paragraph 2?
Yes.
And then you were asked in relation to a series of topics, the second one being the Church's structure and governance, including the role of the Vatican. What are your views in relation to that in terms of contributing factors?
Okay. Well, I mean, I think
would it be easier, Baroness, to talk in terms of leadership?
yes, it probably would. So I think. I mean, the important thing about the churches, and I've understood a lot more about the Vatican and how the Holy See relates to bishops' conferences and bishops around the world. Since I've been a member of the Pontifical Commission, it's been, and I think what I've actually described the Catholic Church as the largest ungoverned organisation in the world, and I don't mean that in an unkind way, but I think what it is that the Pope's role is essentially one of kind of unity around the sort of the teaching of the Church, but in the theology and the doctrine of the Church, and I don't think the Pope really ever saw. He doesn't have any responsibility for what a bishop does in terms of things which relate to civil society. He appoints bishops to take leadership and to provide the leadership in their own diocese, and it's quite a difficult thing to kind of really get to grips with and to understand, and but that sort of subsidiarity that the Church is based on does mean that, just like St. Peter and the Apostles were expected to look to Rome, to look to St. Peter, the same way the bishops are expected to, but it's very much around their pastoral responsibilities. So that when a bishop neglects to respond appropriately and to show the moral authority that is needed when child abuse is present, that's a really tricky thing, because it raises a lot of issues about where does the responsibility lie for holding that bishop accountable. And that's one of the big issues we talked about and have talked about is the issue of bishop accountability. And it leads on then to the motu proprio, like a loving mother, which the Pope issued last summer, which was about the absolute importance of trying to find a way to hold bishops accountable if they're not being held accountable in their own country.
The tribunal. Can you hear me, Bishop? Baroness, I apologise. Yes? I think we're having difficulty hearing you. Could you perhaps speak for me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much. The tribunal that you referred to that was established as a way of holding bishops accountable is no longer continuing. Is that right?
No, I didn't refer to the tribunal. I was referring to the panel of jurists which the Pope set up as a result of the motu proprio that he issued in June last year.
It was originally.
Originally, there was to be a tribunal,
yes.
But when they and the way that he works is if he takes one of our recommendations, then he will delegate the responsibility for implementing that recommendation that's been agreed to one of the congregations, one of the dicasteries. But I think further research suggested that it wasn't necessary. That actually, we don't know exactly what happened, but then he issued the motu proprio as a loving mother. And he said with this letter, the intention is to underline that among the aforesaid grave reasons this is about the possibility of removal from ecclesiastical office, one of the grave reasons is the negligence of a bishop in the exercise of his office, and in particular in relation to cases of sexual abuse inflicted on minors and vulnerable adults. And we understand that that was to come into effect from September 2016.
Did it come into effect from that date?
I believe it came into effect, but I don't yet know what the effect. I don't know, and I think we have to wait and see what that leads to. I mean, what he said was that it would have to be a grave, that he could only be removed if he is objectively lacking in a very grave manner the diligence that his pastoral office demands. So the question about whether it's happened, as far as I know, I'm not aware of any bishop having been removed as yet under this edict.
Did you understand that the Pope had power under canon law to remove a bishop in any event?
Yes, the understanding that we had was that the Pope had the power to remove a bishop, that he is dependent, but there was no process to do so. And in order to have and that's why we understood that a process was needed, because it can't be on the say-so of a media report, or it can't be on the say-so of anything, injustice. There has to be a process. And so there wasn't a process. And that's my understanding is what the panel of jurists is to be about.
Thank you. You indicate in your document to us that local leadership at parish and school levels may need to be improved, with one gap being a relative lack of oversight of diocesan priests. Now, is that a lack of oversight by the bishop?
I think it probably varies hugely. I've been told I've talked to a number of people about this. Some have said to me that they feel that diocesan priests do have as good oversight as anybody else. Others have suggested that it may not be adequate, and that priests. I mean, there are quite a number of ways in which priests are subject to their work is subject to scrutiny, but they are all very much. There are different people who have responsibility for identifying and being aware of, and of course parishioners or anybody with concern would go to a bishop if they had a concern. But yeah.
You also refer to clericalism, and this is over on page 4 under E, Baroness. And you refer to there is a risk that the power, which is part of clericalism, may be misused or simply serve to further isolate the priest. Do you see where I'm reading from?
I think that's right. Yes, I do. I think that's right. I think that's been my experience as a Catholic, kind of in my life, has been that some priests, not all, but some priests, maybe through a feeling of insecurity or because they genuinely believe that they have an authority in a position that they that they do hold a great deal of power. It's not just priests, I mean, members of religious communities as well. And I think I've talked to priests and monks about the issue of power and asked them whether they had any understanding of the amount of power that they hold by virtue of their office and by virtue of the work and the ministry they provide. And I think they are often very unaware of how powerful their positions are perceived by lay people and indeed by religious sisters, for example, who often feel very lacking in power in comparison with an ordained priest. And there is a problem with power because abuse is always a consequence of a misuse of power, and power has to be used very wisely and very carefully. So it's something that hierarchies need to guard against.
Have you noticed any change in the priests and religious that you've been dealing with more recently as a move away from the clericalism approach?
I have seen both a move away from clericalism, but I've also seen others who perhaps in this time of when priests may feel that they are under additional scrutiny, where their clericalism seems undiminished and may indeed be a source of comfort for them.
Does it ultimately come down to a question of education and leadership in respect of priests so that they understand, as you say, the context of power and its abuse, and as well are led in the right direction in terms of how to properly use their position and serve their congregation?
I think to myself that it's really, really important that there is more lay leadership, because I think whilst without that lay kind of levelling of the situation, it's going to be very, very difficult for the ordained church leaders to be able to change the culture of the current leadership. So I think the places where I've seen most change have been where, in parishes, for example, and in dioceses, where the priests and the bishops have really welcomed and not felt threatened by lay leadership. And this obviously includes women, because for many priests and bishops, they may feel more comfortable having lay men advising them and supporting them. But I think until there is a sort of a lay leadership which is able to stand alongside with the ordained priests, then it's going to be very difficult for that perception of power and that the potential misuse of power in any way to pass. And we've seen this in the medical profession in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure you have in Australia as well, where doctors thought that it was perfectly fine for them to, govern themselves, not to be accountable to lay scrutiny. And that's changed, but it's taken quite a while to change that attitude.
In relation to the church, is it a matter for the bishop to determine whether or not there's lay involvement and the extent to which they participate in governing the diocese?
Well, for the bishop, it would be entirely for the bishop to decide how much they wanted to involve lay people in working with them and advising them in either a professional capacity or in a wise council type capacity. But the same would be true at the parish level, where it would be down to an individual priest, unless there was real encouragement from a bishop. But it would be very much down to an individual priest to decide how much he was going to manage his parish himself, or how much he was going to to seek guidance and support from the parishioners, the lay parishioners.
With your knowledge of the structure of the church, who or what body is in a position to provide leadership to bishops and priests so as to encourage them to move in the direction you're speaking of?
Do you mean in the wider church? I mean, of course, people will look to the Bishops' Conference, of course, is a meeting of bishops, but it doesn't have authority over individual bishops, so it's a coming together. So they can debate these issues and discuss them, but it's down to the individual bishop to determine what happens in his diocese. We can look to the Pope to provide leadership, and he does. At the Angelus every day, and in his sermons every day, he's an extraordinary teacher and teaches about moral leadership. Nearly every day he's giving extraordinary teachings, which if people read them and were to learn from them and live by them, then we would see change. But this is, he's talking to the whole world.
I'm sorry, Baroness.
I was just going to say, it is actually the way the church is structured, the individual bishop who is responsible for what happens in his own diocese.
Thank you. You refer to a lack of consistency in the application of ongoing professional supervision in relation to working priests and religious. Is that something that you've experienced in the work you've done?
Probably only anecdotally, just that I understand that when continuing CPD is offered, and if it's about human development, it will be poorly attended. It's not something which is taught, but that's only anecdotal. I've heard it a few times.
As you'd know from your work as a psychiatrist, doctors are required to attend continuing education as lawyers and other professionals. It's not a requirement for priests and religious. Do you think it should be?
Yes, I do.
How could that be imposed?
Well, in the medical world, it's taken quite a long time to impose it. Originally, it was our professional organisations which would recommend, and it's only through since we've had revalidation that in the medical world that we've been able to actually require that this takes place. So prior to that, it was advisory. Now, I'm not sure whether you've introduced revalidation for doctors in Australia yet. I talked about it some years ago when I visited the Australian Medical Association. It's still quite new in the United Kingdom, but it's the first time we've had an appraisal system. I don't see why there couldn't be an appraisal system, and why there shouldn't be, and that's why that appraisal system shouldn't require feedback from parishioners and others with whom a priest or a bishop is in regular contact with. But then the part of that appraisal would require that the priest or bishop would need to show that they were keeping up to date and were familiar with the issues which they were personally responsible for. So it would require quite a lot of structure to do, but I think it's a fundamental importance that the people keep up to date.
Some bishops in Australia have the view that they have no power over their priest and cannot require him to undergo supervision or performance review or indeed mandatory education. What's your view?
I know that some priests feel that that is the case and would resist. I think that's wrong. I think if If they really are trying to point to some rule which says that's the case, then I would say that rule needs to change.
Or perhaps the attitude towards that rule.
Yes.
The
Can I just say that my
Certainly.
experience of talking to priests in some countries has been that they would really welcome more interest in them and in their life, and that some priests. Now, I know in the United States there's research that, for example, Stephen Rossetti has done, where he found that priests were not lonely, but they were content with their lifestyle. The majority of priests were not struggling with their current lifestyle. That I don't believe to be the case in all countries and in all places. And I've certainly come across a number of priests who would really welcome more guidance and support from their bishops.
There's been some talk in Australia about licensing priests in a similar way to which perhaps psychologists are licensed. So a condition of the licence might be continuing education, regular professional supervision and the like. Is that an issue that's come to your attention?
I certainly had discussions with senior people in the church about this. I don't recall us discussing it in the Pontifical Commission. The answer is often that the sacramental part of a priest's role is not something which could be subject to external lay scrutiny. But my view is that there is a professional part of the priest's role which is very similar to the kind of professional role that, for example, doctors and teachers might have.
And counsellors?
And that part of their role could be subject to licensing. So
to separate out the sacramental role, or the role that has theological underpinnings, from that which is essentially of a counsellor or psychologist or dealing pastorally with people, and license or otherwise regulate in some way that role. Is that what you're saying? I think that could be possible, and I've certainly had discussions along those lines. Thank you. Baroness, I'll just go to Ms McCormack and come back to you with any additional comments you wish to make. Ms McCormack, would you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Kathleen Vera McCormack.
I can't quite hear you, Ms McCormack.
Is that better?
Not hugely. Try again.
Kathleen Vera McCormack.
You might just have to speak up a little for us, Ms McCormack.
Can we adjust?
Can you hear me now?
You need to hold the microphone in your hand.
This one.
A bit higher.
Can you tell us your full name?
Kathleen Vera McCormack.
Thank you. And Ms McCormack, you were the Director of Welfare at Catholic Care for a very long time in Wollongong.
In the Diocese of Wollongong, yes.
And I think you began in about 1984.
That's correct. I was appointed Director.
And you were there for 30 years?
In the end, yes, about 30 years.
You would have seen a deal of cultural change over that period.
Well, we started out in very humble beginnings with, I was the only person employed, and then we developed from there.
And what was the organisation like when you left it a couple of years ago?
It was a multi-service organisation employing about 240 people, with services to children, to families, to the school student and family program, to aged care and disabilities. And I think the budget was about 18 million, mostly coming from government.
So mainly government funded?
Mostly government funded,
and
yes.
Regulated because of that government funding, as well as through other means?
Regulated with auditing, etc.
Thank you. Now, you were also a member of the Professional Standards Resource Group for the diocese.
For the diocese in Wollongong, yes.
And that was for 3 years in the late 1990s?
That's correct. That was in the time when Bishop Philip Wilson was there. He was there from 97 to 2000.
And that was shortly after Towards Healing came into effect? Or...
Yes, when Towards Healing came in, Bishop Philip set up that group, and he was able to secure members from the community, 2 members who are not Catholic, and mostly lay people. I think 1 priest was on it.
How did that group work in those days?
It worked extremely well because at the time we had a number of cases in Wollongong, and we're dealing with and working with the victims and survivors, and the support of the people from the community was very. It really helped the bishop to make really good decisions and really make sure that the victims and survivors were supported.
Did you find that the presence of lay people in that group and in the work that you were doing enhanced the ability of the diocese and the bishop to understand what was being experienced and to try and help people as best the diocese could?
It really helped because we had people there. We had psychologists who worked in the community. We had people who worked in the Department of Community Services. We had lawyers and also people who worked on the ground just in the local community. But they really came with a wealth of knowledge and also knew some of the causes of child sexual abuse. And they were able to help the bishop to make really sound decisions. And what I was really impressed with at the time was that the bishop did listen, and he learned and was open to learning as to why this was happening and how we could deal with it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've been on the Pontifical Commission for how long?
Since 2015.
How did that come about?
I think you'd have to ask Sheila Hollins that. But I was the new member appointed, and apparently what happened was that they were looking, with the commission, they were looking for people with different skills from all over the world, and they have very qualified people like psychiatrists, canon lawyers. They have people who have worked with survivors and victims. And I think one of the things that when they looked to Australia, they were looking for someone not with the intellectual or the academic background, but someone who had on-the-ground experience. So I think that's how my name came up, because of the experience I had in Wollongong and especially in New South Wales.
You're chair of the Education Working Group?
I'm chair of that, yes.
And what has that work focused on?
Well, mostly it's focusing on the education of families and children to really alert them to the culture of sexual abuse and really about a culture of safety. But what's really hard about that group is that we're dealing with the whole world, and we can learn from what's happened in Australia and the United States, in the UK and Ireland. But in some countries we're dealing with, and 2 of the sisters on the commission with us, Sister Kahula and Sister Hermangill, they're from Africa. And in Africa, child abuse is not even a crime. And they're working all the time, protecting children and trying to educate them. So we have to take into account, while we can learn from what's happened in the countries around us, that, okay, but we've got to, when we're helping to teach those countries, to really take into account their culture and not further upset them. But what we're doing in Rome before the plenary in March, we're having a day at the Gregorian University where, to start, we've invited 3 countries, Colombia, Argentina and Mexico, to come and share with us what they're doing, and we can try and learn from them and look at the gaps. We're also having our Mr Francis Sutherland from the Truth, Justice and Healing to come over and talk about the experience in Australia, so we can start to look at these different areas and see then with the Gregorian University under the guidance of Hans Zollner to start research as to how we can start working with different cultures in the world. But we're in our infancy. This is just a start. It's years and years of hard work that we have to look at.
You say that the Pontifical Commission is experiencing difficulties in reaching the performance stage of its development as a result of infrequent meetings, limited resources and structural and cultural barriers both in the church and across nations.
That's true. And when I say that, like, the people on the Commission, the people working on it, come from all over the world, and they are so committed to the task. They really give wholeheartedly. They're volunteers. And when they come to Rome for the plenary, the work goes on there. But when they go back to their countries, the work continues all the time. I mean, people like myself, Sheila and Bill, our work groups, we Skype sometimes twice a month. Like, it's ongoing. But the thing is, we're in the Vatican. We're advisory to the Holy Father. Our budget would be what you would do in a diocese. But we're dealing with the whole world. And I just look at what's happened here at the Royal Commission in Australia and the money that's had to be spent to look at what went wrong. If we could mobilise the Catholic Church in the world to help us with the Pontifical Commission to be in a position of prevention rather than cure. So we're looking to the Royal Commission, we're following everything, all the research and such. But I think part of our role, this is just my thinking, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Commission now, my thinking is if we can really reach out to the world to help us so that we can be in a very good position about prevention in the future, especially with the countries in the third world we're moving into.
Thank you. You quote a letter that the Baroness recently wrote in relation to criticism in overseas media that the Vatican was moving too slowly in this area. And Baroness, I'm not sure that you have a copy of that with you. Do you have a copy of Ms McCormack's notes?
Yes, I do.
You'll see on page 2 she sets out a letter that you wrote and says that she agrees with that. Now, what were the circumstances of writing the letter?
The Guardian newspaper had published an article about a review of a book written by somebody who previously worked in the Vatican called Fittipaldi. And it made some criticisms of the Pontifical Commission, saying that it had only met twice. And I responded with a brief letter correcting and saying that Pope Francis wasn't serious about addressing child abuse. And I disagree with that. I think he's very serious about trying to address it. So I simply wrote to the Guardian saying that actually I was a member of the Pontifical Commission and that I personally had attended, I think it's 8 plenary meetings, but also that the majority of our work took place in working groups. This was responded to by other people. And so I wrote again in rather more detail because the criticism was suggested that I wasn't acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. And so I wrote a second letter the same week, which was also published, and this is the letter.
You refer in this letter to the fact that for many years bishops have been advised to cooperate fully with civil authorities, but that some still fail to do so, and it's a matter of huge concern. Is that failure a current failure, according to the information available to you?
Well, it's very difficult because we don't deal with individual cases. We don't receive cases. We will only know about cases that are reported on in the media, for example, or through more informal sources, because that's not our role to deal with individual cases. But the fact that complaints are still made about a failure of bishop accountability, I suspect that there will be countries in the world where this issue has still not actually really reached their consciousness as being relevant to them. I'll give you just one example briefly, and it was when we had the conference in 2012 at the Gregorian University, where after Mary Collins spoke very, very powerfully about her own experience, one African bishop stood up and said, "Thank you so much, because I wondered why I had come to this conference. I thought this was a Western issue. I didn't realise it applied in my country. You've opened my eyes. I now realise that it is an issue in my country, and I was unaware of it." And I think that insight and realisation and awareness is something which the Commission is working hard through its educational endeavours to change, so that there is a wider awareness. And it's some of the work that Kath McCormack was speaking about, the importance of raising awareness so that people actually recognise the signs that abuse may be happening or that there may be risk of it. And so the question about whether there are still bishops who are not cooperating fully, we suspect is true. And of course, what we also know is that there are some countries where civil authorities, it may be very difficult to cooperate with civil authorities because civil authorities may not perceive this as a crime, but may see the allegation and the reporter of the crime as the problem and punish the reporter of the crime.
Baroness, Ms McCormack identified what I understand to be a need for more resources for the Commission to effectively carry out its work. I hope I've got it right. She nods. Do you share that view?
I do. I think I do share that view.
Well, then, can I ask you, why can't the Pope help you?
Well, we've been. I mean, setting up this commission has been quite a complex thing because, as Catherine Cormack spoke about, we are trying to find ways of raising awareness and introducing guidelines, which I'm sure Bill Kilgallen will speak about, which will be relevant and meaningful and effective in all countries in the world where the Church is operating. So why can't the Pope help us? Well, to some extent, we have to understand what the resources are that we need. And the resources are, in my view, about the administrative competencies to be able to run a very effective organisation. And I think that perhaps the Vatican itself, how can I put this, maybe haven't understood the possibility of, when we see the organisation and the competencies involved in the Australian Royal Commission, we don't have that level of support. We have some individual, very well qualified members, but in terms of the support that backs it up, they're very good, very committed staff, but they don't have that breadth of experience. I think a larger, more professionally organised body would be able to provide.
Well, again, the same question. Why can't you go to the Pope and say, we don't have the resources we need to effectively carry out our work?
I think that may well be something that we will be wanting to feed back to him when we complete our review that we're undergoing at the moment. We're looking at the future of the Commission at our next meeting.
Back to you, Ms McCormack. In the notes that you provided for the Royal Commission, you set out some challenges that you think exist in Australia in terms of child safety, complaint handling and risk management.
With complaint handling, I really believe that it's ongoing education all the time and that we can never have enough education about it. And also within the Church, I think we've really done our best in some areas to get it across. But one of the things that I'm really impressed with what is being pressed in being set up with the Professional Standards Limited, which will be overseeing the work of the Catholic Church. But to do that, you can have all the audits in the world, like my experience with aged care, disability and childcare, where we had to meet the requirements, etc., like the children's guardian, age and disabilities, etc. You can tick the boxes all the time, and the 5 years comes up and you do the audit again. But if you don't start to have an alert culture and it become part of the staff and the people working with children, you're missing the point. So I think it's education, 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 and that people start to pick up the behaviours of people, to look at the safe environments, to look at people who are not following the guidelines of the organisation, to look at people who work in isolation, so that all the staff start to understand the indicators. And I think that's what has to happen. It's got to be an alert culture and that people are working at it all the time.
You refer to the pastoral approach to management often taken within the church is a soft-handed approach?
Just in my experience and working in the church, that I think that's where the bishops come unstuck, because as a bishop they're a pastor to their priest and they take the pastoral approach, and it's on about forgiveness, and at times they don't realise that the person they're taking the pastoral approach to is really managing them very well. They're not dealing with the issue. The recipient is just continuing that behaviour. So I really think that some of the things that Baroness Holland spoke about with professional guidance and also with priests being accountable is really important, because I really believe it's very hard for bishops. One of my experiences is that working with the bishops, I've been able to enable them to take some responsibility for what's happened, and they've really learnt about sexual abuse of children, etc. But it's been the clergy who have not come with them, and even to this day there would still be some clerical priest who would not agree with what the bishop is trying to do for the care of protection in their diocese. And
is the structure thus that those bishops can do what they wish to do, notwithstanding it's contrary to the bishop's wishes?
Yeah, and the structure, could you just repeat that?
Within the diocese with the bishop's role in relation to the priest.
It is the structure in the diocese, but hopefully with what's coming out of the Royal Commission and what the bishops are looking to do together at the Bishops' Conference, that they'll all start to learn what their real role is and be able to work together on that for the future.
You'll have heard Baroness Holland's answers to questions about professional supervision, mandatory continuing training and some sort of performance review as being part and parcel of a priest's life. What do you have to say about that?
Look, I agree with that. Look, a number of my colleagues and friends are priests and they do operate like that. They're very responsible people, they're professional people, they have ongoing training, they have supervision, they go, they try to help others to do it as well. So it is possible, but I just think the leadership has to make sure that it happens and instill in them.
And by the leadership, you mean the bishops?
I mean the bishops, yes.
Thank you.
And the bishops themselves. Like, some bishops are really up, take courses. They have their professional retreats, they do, and I know that in each diocese they do have in-service days, and apparently priests are supposed to attend those in-service days, but some don't. And especially around child protection, I think it's very serious, because in the workplace, in places like Catholic Education and Catholic Care and any other organisation in the diocese, if people haven't done their child protection training and have ongoing training in that, that's part of them not being further employed. Well, I think that should be for the priest as well, if the priest is a parish priest.
Thank you. You speak in your notes about the Catholic Professional Standards Limited, the company you've referred to earlier, and you say there that it is to be hoped that dioceses will report on abuse cases and their strategies, etc., When you say it is to be hoped, do you have some doubt that that will occur?
Look, I've been very encouraged by listening to the hearing here and over the last couple of weeks, and hearing the religious leaders and the bishops saying that they're going to go along with this, that they agree with it. But I think it is about the leadership making sure that all their people who are in their communities or dioceses come along with it. And the whole thing is that we have got, in New South Wales, we have very good guidelines that we follow. We're fortunate, but it would be good if that was Australia-wide, because then you've got an external body that's really monitoring what's happening.
What you seem to be saying is that it effectively depends upon the qualities of the bishop as to what the culture will be within that diocese.
I think that's right.
And same with the parish priests. Their personal qualities will determine what happens in their parish.
Yes. Yeah.
And whether or not they involve laity in the work they do?
Well, see, one of the things that my experience has been that laity have been very involved, and as I said, I've been very fortunate in the diocese that I worked in, because I had a bishops that did listen, and I was able to work with them and able to lead them to put appropriate processes in place, and also that before I left the diocese, it was women who were doing all the work around child protection. So that was a real breakthrough, and that is continuing, and I know that. So I do think a lot of bishops are very open to that.
Thank you. You speak about training as being very important and education as being very important, and you provide some statistics from 2015 in relation to the United States. This is on page 6 of your notes, and you say that from its 2015 audit, the Catholic Church in the United States has already trained 98% of its volunteers, employees, educators, clergy and candidates in parishes how to create safe environments and prevent sexual abuse, and prepared more than 4.3 million children to recognise abuse and protect themselves. Now, I take it that's the sort of work that you would be encouraging take place in Australia.
Most definitely, yes. And I think that's the sort of work with the Pontifical Commission we would be looking at hope to do to get other countries to do that. And one of the things too that in Australia, and I can only speak about the diocese that I've worked in, that there has been a lot of good processes put in place, while with a lot of things that haven't been done appropriately. But I think we need to start talking about how we do educate, what are the requirements for people to work in a diocese, whether they're a teacher, a social worker, psychologist or a priest, and then to make sure that within that diocese that we then tell people, what is going on, how many cases there have been, how we've dealt with it, what education programs have gone on, so that people we can start to alert people who live in the community that we are trying to be an alert culture for children.
Thank you. Can I turn to your colleague? Would you tell the Royal Commission your full name?
Yes, it's William Francis Kilgallen.
Thank you, Mr.
Bill, generally.
Thank you, Mr. Kilgallen. And your current position?
I currently work for the Catholic Church in New Zealand as Director of the National Office for Professional Standards.
And you've been a member of the Pontifical Commission since December 2015?
Yes, I joined with the same time as Kath.
How did your appointment come about?
I was consulted about the membership of the Commission and recommended somebody that I thought would be very suitable to be a member of the Commission, and had a reply inviting me to join the Commission.
And was it your background in professional standards, do you think, that caused you to be invited?
No, I think it was because that's something much sort of later in my life. It's a mixture of my experience in... I started my working life as a Catholic priest in a city called Leeds in the north of England, as you'd guess by the accent, and spent most of my working life there. I went there in 1970, and in 1971 I set up an organisation to work with homeless people because there were lots of them in the city centre, and set up an independent organisation to work with them, and then trained in social work, and then went back to work there, and then left the priesthood and carried on in that work and developed that organisation. Now, people who end up homeless on the streets are there for a variety of reasons. Many of them had serious issues with alcohol misuse, serious mental health problems. So over the years we developed services for drinkers, we developed services for street drug users, and a series of services for people with mental health problems and learning disabilities. So I ran that organisation for, I think, 24 years. And from starting in a basement building behind the cathedral, by the time I left it, we were working across the northeast of England, had about 850 staff, and providing a wide range of services. And at the same time, I got involved in the politics of the city, and so was on the city council and on various health service management boards. And in the early 80s, the issue of sexual abuse in families started to become really apparent. And one of the paediatricians in the city and a police officer did some really pioneering work in recognising it and taking action. And they faced very, very severe criticism. People did not want to hear the message in the city. And I was, at that time, responsible for social services on the city council. And so it fell to me to get involved very closely with them and, if you like, stand alongside them in that work. I got involved then over the years in a number of advisory bodies to government on mental health issues and on learning disabilities and on the training of social workers at national level, and eventually then went to work heading up an organisation the government had set up called the Social Care Institute of Excellence, which looked at trying to identify what works in social work and social care, and then set guidance for policy and practice to set the standards so that the inspectorates could go in and look at those services and measure them against best practice. And so I did that for some years in London. And I'd earlier in my career as well been involved in a couple of inquiries, one into very serious failures in a local authority children's service in the northeast of England, where in residential care there had been systematic and continued sexual abuse of children. And I was appointed to lead that inquiry. And again, an inquiry into a hospital for people with learning disabilities where there'd been significant abuse and really major failures in the management of that hospital that was part of the National Health Service.
Can I bring you to the Pontifical Commission?
Yeah.
Is your work there primarily in relation to the guidelines?
That has been the focus up till now, mainly developing those guidelines. And the guidelines are important because you've got to have a starting point. The guidelines, if they're not followed...
Can I just stop you for a minute so you can, explain what the guidelines are about?
Yeah, we start off with, these guidelines are a template for the church around the world. Each conference of bishops is required to have a set of guidelines about how they will prevent and respond to sexual abuse. And so we've given them a template to draw up their guidelines on. And it starts from the foundations are the gospel, that this isn't some kind of optional extra, that children and vulnerable adults should be safe. This is absolutely central to the mission of the Church. And the second foundation is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Child. Because right through, wherever the abuse takes place, whether it's in the church, in government establishments or wherever, those children are being abused, their rights are being ignored, and that's a fundamental issue for us, that children have rights. And so that's where we begin. The next stage is that within a country or set of countries that are grouped together, there should be one set of guidelines that every diocese and every religious order signs up to. So we don't want a situation where you've got a country where everybody agrees it except one rogue bishop doing his own thing, or one rogue order saying, we don't want to sign up to that. It needs to be a coherent set of guidelines for the whole country. And then it goes through a fairly logical process of saying, we need to have safe recruitment, we need to have good training of the people we recruit, we need to develop a safe church environment, and that includes having education and awareness raising. We then need to see what happens when abuse does happen, that there are good structures for responding to abuse. And then the next section is about how we work with survivors and victims, and then finally about offenders. And the last section says when you've got all this in place, you need a monitoring system, a system of audit and monitoring that has some independence and that can look at each diocese and order and say if they are carrying out what are in the guidelines. And so that's the structure we're recommending to every country.
When you say you're recommending, is it the Commission that's recommending it, or is it Pope Francis that's recommending it?
At this stage, it's the Commission that's recommending it. It will be, and we've published it on our website, as you've seen, because you've read that. And I think it's a very useful template. Now, we're working across the world, and we're working with some countries where they don't have much in the way of a developed system of safeguarding for children and vulnerable adults. And so we've had initial talks with some of the Catholic development agencies, and they're willing to help in those countries to promote the structures and develop and train people to undertake this sort of work.
Do you have any system in place for determining whether, and if so, who has taken up or not taken up the guidelines?
One of the proposals that we're looking at next month is having an assessment, have somebody review all the guidelines that are currently in existence. So there'll be 120 bishops' conferences, roughly. It might be 120 at the most, I think. Reviewing all those, analysing them, seeing how they compare with the template, and then working to see how we can assist those countries to develop it, particularly those that are way off the mark. And that will need a significant research capability.
And I take it in terms of your dealings with these 120-odd, did you say bishops' conferences?
Yeah. That
your role is one of influence and persuasion, with the imprimatur of the Pope behind you, having established the Commission.
That's right. Now that's whether influence will change. How long that influence will take is a matter of debate. But that's the approach that's being taken, and the same system works within our work across the Vatican as well, that because our remit is broad, we don't fit with any departments in the Vatican, but our work touches many of them. And so, for example, the congregation that's responsible for training clergy has, in its last directive about training clergy, said that there must be, in seminary training, specific modules on safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults. And so that has to be introduced into all seminaries. And their reference for that is work that's been done by the Pontifical Commission. So our work touches many of the departments, and that's a challenge too, that anybody who's worked with government, whether it's in church or in the state, knows how jealously government departments guard their own domain, and there can be some pushback about taking advice from others.
The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith has quite a significant role in relation to priests who are accused of, and the bishop accepts some semblance of a truth about their conduct. And perhaps I might ask this of you, Baroness. There's been evidence that in Australia the CDF is very slow in responding to matters that are brought to its attention by Australian bishops. Now, I understand that there's no functional relationship between you and the CDF. However, Cardinal O'Malley, I think, has recently been appointed to the CDF. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What have been, if any, your dealings or interactions with the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith?
Well, one of the first appointed members of the Pontifical Commission was a professor of canon law, a lay professor of canon law, who was employed as a staff member within the Congregation of Doctrine of the Faith. He resigned from the commission last year because he felt that he couldn't give the time that he needed, and I don't know the full reasons, but we were told that he had decided he couldn't make the contribution that was needed. But that was very useful having him. It was also very difficult for him because he only spoke Italian, and the working language of the Commission is English, and most people have at least some English, but it does make communication very difficult, even with good interpreters. And the other thing that has happened is that we had our last meeting, a staff member from the CDF came to the meetings, and Bill Kilgarry could say more about that, because one of the reasons he came was specifically to work with the Guidelines Working Group.
Yes, we have identified in every department a link person with the Commission, and the link person identified by the CDF was an American canon lawyer working in the CDF, and he was very helpful in the last meeting we had in talking to us about the guidelines. Sadly, he's returned to the USA because appointments to the Vatican are for a fixed period, usually of 5 or 7 years. People go from different countries, and so we'll hopefully get as good a link person again. But there are challenges there, as I say, about relating to departments.
There's equally been evidence that the process with the CDF works reasonably well. So there's differing evidence before the Royal Commission about that. Has either of you, or have either of you had any dealings with the CDF, or others who have had dealings with the CDF, to be able to comment on that?
Yes, I think I've had dealings there, and the process I've found to be slow, and I think there are systems that could be improved considerably. It could be dealt with regionally instead of everything being sent to Rome. The risk of that is that regions would not do it well, but the CDF could have the auditing role rather than the doing role. And that would, I think, be more effective, so that you could have a region, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, PNG and the Solomon Islands as a group, for example, and do it regionally and have some expertise attached to that.
Is there any role that the Commission has in relation to raising an issue like that?
Yes, one of our working groups looks at particular issues about canon law, and so we're meeting this time. They've looked at a number of issues in canon law, and for example, one of the issues I've asked them to look at is within canon law there is the equivalent of a statute of limitations for dealing with sexual abuse cases of 20 years, which can be dispensed with on a case-by-case basis, and usually is. And I'm recommending that they request a change to canon law so that there is no statute of limitations, because the statute of limitations, in my experience, is a great disservice to those who've been abused. It does nothing for them. It only serves to protect the organisation and sometimes the abuser.
Thank you. Now, I think we might be having some difficulties with the video connection. Can you hear me, Baroness?
I can hear you, yes. I can't see you anymore. It says that somebody's left the meeting. The lights went off in the room, and I think the security officer came to turn them back on again, but just when he did that, the video connection disappeared. So I could go and just call him and ask him to come back, but I can hear you.
Why don't we just continue without seeing you but hearing you?
We can't see you either, Baroness.
Okay.
Baroness, is there anything you wish to add, having heard the evidence of the other two members?
I agree with what they've said, and I think I think one thing I'd like to say is that I think we are all speaking as individuals. We're not actually representing the Pontifical Commission, and that's quite important because so that's one thing. Is there anything else that I'd like to say? No, I don't think so.
Baroness, that comment intrigues me. Would the Commission say different things?
I haven't. I think the individual members will have different perspectives. I don't think they would say. I don't think all of the Commission members would necessarily agree with everything that I've said, because people will have their individual perspectives. And remember, people come from all over the world, so their own experience will be different.
Yes, I mean, we're not, as a group, developing any party line. And if we did, I think some of us would choose not to be there. The invitation was quite clear that we were there as individuals because of the experience we've had. And certainly I would personally resist any attempt to say that this is a line you will follow, because that's not, I don't see that as our purpose.
It leads to a further question. The picture you all paint from an outsider's point of view is of a world organisation which is struggling to come to terms with the safety of children.
Yep.
And its responsibilities in that area. Is that right?
I would agree with that, yes. Yeah.
Baroness, do you share that?
Yes, I do. I think as a total leadership, that is true. I think the Pope does understand the seriousness of it, and I think there are many other leaders who do. But I think for the organisation with the leadership that it has, there are some people struggling to come to terms with it.
Now, insofar as you each make your contribution as you do you have confidence that you have the capacity, resources and, if you like, the power to actually influence change?
I would say that although we've not been refused anything, we haven't had any request for funding denied at all. I think the way that the Commission has been structured in terms of the support staff is inadequate, and I think those inadequacies will be discussed at our next meeting, because we have a session about that, and I think we've all got views on how that could be improved. It's early days in those terms, and I think we have to learn from experience elsewhere. I have to say that looking at this Commission, I have followed this Commission very closely. You know, although we're only over the ditch there, New Zealand doesn't always see Australia as a model in anything. But
I'm surprised.
But we've been following this. I've been following this, and one of the things that's really impressed me is the approach you've taken to research. It seems to me that you've had a very systematic, well thought out programme, and you've commissioned research widely into some really important topics. I have to say I was pleased to see my former organisation undertaking one of the research proposals. But that's of value not just in Australia, but throughout the world, because many of the issues you've looked at apply elsewhere. And there's a huge amount of learning that you've brought from us there. Now, we as a Commission, can follow that example. Take an issue that was debated yesterday with the religious orders about whether people should be kept within communities or not. As far as I can see, there's no evidence base for taking a decision on that. There's been no research that I'm aware of as to whether sending people, detaching them from the community or keeping them in community, whether one works better than the other. And that's an area of research that we're talking about, whether we should commission from the Pontifical Commission, specifically looking at that, because it seems to me a crucial issue.
You realise that the significance of the work that you're doing in relation to the whole church is of fundamental importance to individual countries.
Yeah.
Because insofar as this Commission has identified, recognised and discussed problems with culture, practices and the way the church conducts itself in Australia, real change will only occur if it's coming, as we understand the process, if it's coming from Rome, ultimately.
Yeah.
And I assume you all share that perspective.
I'd just like to, if I could, answer the question about the Commission and when Bill answered you. And I would just like to say that when I first started out in this work in the late 80s and the 90s, there was such resistance. I worked in such isolation because no one believed what was happening, and we had no guidelines, we had no processes, no map, and we just had to work our way through it. And through doing that, we were able to draw the state into it and child protection, everything, we were able to do it. And that's how I experienced Rome. The only way that I can stand it is that I have to have hope. And it's like water on a rock. We've just got to keep at it. And just the few things that we have achieved, and I think one of the greatest things is with the formation of bishops, that now Cardinal O'Malley and members of the Commission are there speaking to the bishops and educating them about child protection, and that's happening already. So if we can start there in Rome, maybe that can have a ripple effect through the world. So we know how serious it is, but it's the responsibility we have, and as I said, it's hope.
Baroness, do you want to say anything on that subject?
Yes, well, when we first started out, there were big issues about what kind of organisation would we be. Would we be entirely independent? Who would fund us? What would our relationship be with other organisations within the Vatican? And whereas on the one hand, some members were very keen that we should be entirely independent, in the end, it was decided that we would become what's called an autonomous institution within the Vatican. We're actually not like any other organisation within the Vatican. We were very clear that we didn't want to be part of a dicastery or part of a congregation because we wanted to be separate. However, there are real difficulties in doing that, and part of what we've been doing over this 3 years, and it may seem that it's taken us a long time to get to where we've got, is that we've been having to establish relationships, try to understand how things are done within what is essentially an Italian kind of organisation. And I think we believe very strongly that the church should be paying this work, that we shouldn't be raising money from outside or from philanthropy, that we should be looking to the church to fund it. But trying to work out what we need to have in place in order to be able to have the influence that we need is quite difficult. And I think the way that Kath McCormack has just put it about, trying to find the map which will enable us to know where we should be putting our efforts. And I would just say one more thing, which is that rather than actually do research ourselves, I do think that we're beginning to understand the need to engage other people to do some of that work. And we're going to have to work through partners. There's no way a small organisation or even a big organisation could ever do what needs to be done across the world. So it is going to be through educating leaders, through educating church leaders, through commissioning or encouraging research to take place in other places. So, for example, the Centre for Child Protection now has 6 PhD students coming from different countries who are doing research on formation around issues which have been raised by the working group on formation in the Pontifical Commission. And it's those kind of partnerships and the partnerships that Bill Kilgallen spoke about with the Catholic Development Agencies, where we need other people to be supporting our work and really developing it. But that sort of central organisation, I would say, is still a work in progress. We haven't got it right yet.
Mr. Needham, do you have any questions?
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a couple of things. Thank you. Ms. McCormack, could I just ask, you mentioned an alert culture when you talked about auditing and ticking the box and that sort of thing. As well as an alert culture, though, would you not agree that there needs as well to be a supportive culture so that if someone does see a boundary violation or something that concerns them, they can go to the appropriate management level and be fully supported in raising that issue and not be the subject of any criticism or punishment?
Well, that's what I'd mean by an alert culture, is that everybody's on the same bus, that people all take responsibility. It's not just management, but if a colleague sees a colleague not following the guidelines or working individually with children, that they would have enough, they would have the confidence to go forward. That's what I'm talking about.
Would you see the responsibility for inculcating that sort of culture in any organisation as starting at the top?
Of course, yes. Yeah. But I think with the top being open to the suggestions of the people in the workplace as well.
Yes, and in the Catholic diocese, that would be the bishop.
Yes, but and the thing in the Catholic diocese, that the bishops do have professional standards groups, and hopefully there are a lot of people there who are qualified in education, in welfare, etc., and understand child protection completely, and that's where that would happen.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything to that, Mr. Kilgallen?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely essential, and certainly I found in the work I did in the UK with the church that one of the best ways of getting people into training was the commitment that the bishops and congregation leaders made, that they would themselves have safeguarding training on a regular basis. And so they could then encourage or direct people in the church, their bishop, their priests, their religious, to follow that example. And you're absolutely right, it's that creating a culture in an organisation where people can report concerns, where they will be listened to and it will be acted upon. That's absolutely essential in any organisation.
Yes, thank you for that. And Baroness Hollands, can I just ask you, you mentioned, as I understood it from your evidence before the Commission, that there was a difficulty perhaps for the Pope in terms of removing a bishop from office without very, very strong evidence to do so. Is that a fair summary of what you said?
Well, I think it's about being, I mean, for any legal process to take place, people need to have the case presented, and for that case to be, clearly presented. It shouldn't just be on the word of. It shouldn't, in my view, be done kind of just privately, quietly, without some kind of process. At the moment, we were told that there was no such process. That it was, that if there was a complaint about a bishop, that it would probably be a cardinal who would take that case. So this is just such a process.
Yes, and could I just ask, are you aware generally of any bishops that have been removed from office in the United Kingdom?
Well, I know of bishops that are. Bill probably knows, because in your previous job you would know whether that had happened. I'm aware of one bishop at the moment who is has been stood aside from his diocese pending investigation.
And do you know if that's for failure to act in terms of child sexual abuse matters?
That wasn't in terms of child sexual abuse, no.
Do you know what it was for?
It was for an allegation of a sexual relationship with one or more women.
And no other matters that you're aware of in the United Kingdom where a bishop has been removed from office?
I'm not. I don't know whether Bill Kilgallen is aware. Perhaps Mr. Kilgallen might respond. Thank you.
I mean, Sheila's correct that a bishop in England was removed. He's been replaced. And in the other parts, another part of the United Kingdom, Scotland, which in church terms is a separate country and separate hierarchy, the cardinal there was stood down as a cardinal because of inappropriate sexual behaviour with adult males who were, he was in a position of power over them as a seminary rector and then as a bishop.
Thank you.
And there's one fairly close to here, the Archbishop in Guam is currently being processed by the Vatican for alleged, he's been accused of abusing children, and there's a statute of limitations in Guam because it's a US dependency and the US is very keen on statutes of limitations, and he's currently going through a Vatican trial. So there, he's the most local to here that I know of.
Baroness Hollands, it's Commissioner Murray here. Baroness, earlier in your evidence, you said one of the important issues included transparency and openness. The evidence to the Royal Commission in Australia has been that a lack of internal accountability and a culture of secrecy and concealment, even between bishops and within individual dioceses, has allowed damage to accelerate and accumulate because matters weren't dealt with in a timely and responsive fashion. Tremendous damage, therefore, to the Church's reputation. Overcoming a culture like that is a massive enterprise, do you genuinely, as an involved person in the Pontifical Commission, believe there is a climate at large to end that culture of secrecy and concealment and to really introduce genuine transparency and openness and internal accountability at least?
I think this is a really big difficulty, and I think it's associated with. I think it's linked to clericalism, and I think it's linked to. I think to change that culture is really, really difficult. The remarkable film that was made about the sexual abuse situation in Boston, which I presume you've seen.
Yes.
We watched that as a commission, and fundamentally, one of the things that it showed was the way in which secrecy was really so damaging. And, you know, my feeling is that film ought to be watched, you know, by church leaders all over the world so that they can understand how that came about, how damaging it was. Because sometimes one needs different ways to try to get across to people just what secrecy means. And it's, for me as a psychiatrist, I've seen it all the time in families where they will keep secrets, or in organisations where secrets are kept because it felt that if the truth came out, it would hurt people more. And it's exactly the reverse, that the truth is usually much less bad, you know, than what people fear. And so secrecy is a bad thing on the whole. But people don't understand that. And it's really, really hard to change cultures.
That was the point of my question. I'm not yet convinced that the climate exists for that culture to change in that fashion.
I don't think I don't think it's just an edict from above which can change it. I think it's a process which has to be undergone, and there are lots of people trying to change that culture. The Pontifical Commission is one of them. But it takes a long time to change cultures. I know that from my work with institutions, for example. And you know, one of your research reports, which was about institutions, show how difficult it is in total institutions, in closed institutions, to help people to change and to understand the harm that's caused by those kind of closed organisations.
Thank you, Baroness.
Ms. Needham.
Baroness, just a couple of questions for you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. It's Jane Needham. I'm representing the Truth, Justice and Healing Council in this hearing. You were asked some questions about how the Commission was formed and your role in choosing personnel for that for the Commission. Do you recall those?
Yes, I didn't choose people. The members were asked to help to identify members, and so I participated actively in making inquiries through my own networks to see whether I could identify people with the right skills. And
was there, I'm sorry, you noted that there was a balance of gender and a mix of clerical and lay members on the Commission. Was that a thoughtful process which was engaged in to have that outcome?
Well, for me it was absolutely imperative that the Commission members would include a majority of lay people. And it was also very important to me that there should be at least an equal number of women, because I felt that without the Commission wouldn't have any credibility, and that there would be a real risk that the lay voice would be marginalised. And I also felt that it was very important that the survivor voice should be present, however hard that might be for survivors. And that is, in fact, what we've achieved. We have achieved an equal number, I think, of women and a majority of lay people.
And has there been, to your observation, an acceptance by the Holy Father of advice from a body with a balance of women and a majority of lay people?
Absolutely, yes.
Now, day one of the hearing, Ms Furness opened in a statement, which I think you've seen, and noted that you had declined the Chair's invitation to give oral evidence, preferring to rely on a submission. Do you have a comment about that?
Well, I felt that the questions that were being asked were quite complex, and that to answer those through video link would be very difficult, and I said that I preferred to give written evidence. I submitted my written evidence and had expected that I might have some follow-up requesting further information, or indeed if people were still wanting to have a video interview with me, that they would ask. But I, in fact, had no further response to the submission that I made until very recently.
Thank you, Baroness. And finally, for Mr Kilgallen, you were asked some questions about tab 46 of the tender bundle, which is the guidelines, the template guidelines. And these came up in evidence I think last week. And there was some query about the status of the guidelines, whether they were draft or in development, or whether that was the final form. Would you be able to give the assistance, your assistance to the Commission on that point?
Yes, this is the final form. The reference at the top of on the website to, I think it says a beta version, is the beta version of the website, not of the content. So it's the website that's still in development.
Thank you. There's no further questions, Commissioner.
Your Honour, just one matter arising from the guidelines. There's reference in Part 9 to responding to complaints of abuse, and the second dot point says there should be a clear statement about compliance with the requirements of civil authorities and church authorities, including any civil requirements on mandatory reporting.
Yes.
Now, I think Cardinal O'Malley has said recently that his view was there was a moral obligation to report, notwithstanding a legal requirement. Do you remember him saying that?
I do indeed, yes.
Was there a discussion when developing these guidelines about whether his view should be reflected in the guidelines?
Yes. There's a discussion, and it's a continuing one, about how we can have a guideline on mandatory reporting for all countries, because there are some countries in which we've been told by people living there that for somebody to report abuse to the civil authority puts them at risk, particularly in countries where there are particular versions of Sharia law, where for example, if a woman reports a sexual assault by a man, she can, in some countries, be also jailed for having sexual intercourse outside marriage, even though it was unwilling. She wasn't consenting. So in some countries, it would present a real difficulty in protecting the victim. Now, we need to phrase that in such a way that that doesn't give a let-out to those countries which do have a proper system of reporting and where it would be safe to report. So I think that my assessment is that the guidance will be adapted to say that, and this is certainly what we're looking at, so it's a bit premature to say it will be agreed, but it's likely to say, in my view, that the general rule should be that the Church reports offences, except where a country establishes very clearly that that would create greater risk for the victim. And sadly, there are those countries. And of course, there are countries where it's not considered to be a crime.
You say that's your assessment of the guidance that that may come. Has it been discussed within the Commission?
Yes,
so
and
as to know whether the majority view is...
And it's being discussed again next month.
I see.
Yeah.
Are you in the majority?
I don't know. But it's... I think the difficulty for some countries that's been expressed to us is that they see it as a very Western solution. You know, they say it's okay for you in countries where there is a trustworthy police force, but in a country where there isn't that trust, where there isn't a reliable civil authority, and where that person will be at risk, then they've got to exercise some judgment about that. So I think we've got to find a way of and that's one of the challenges of working across the world, that we're talking to some countries where the most significant abuse of children is that they're drafted into the armed forces at the age of 7 and 8. They become child soldiers. In other countries where the biggest issue is that children are being sold into sex trafficking, and that's often with the connivance and the involvement of authorities, rather than expecting any protection from authorities. So that's a really difficult issue for countries that, as I say, are at a stage where they don't have stable civil government and a government that accepts that this is a crime.
The way you have spoken of dealing with it, that is an exception where it would do harm to report, is one way of dealing with those two very different systems, isn't it?
That's my view. Yes, that we'd need to move to that, because it's. I think it's important that people realise that abusing children is a crime, and that people who do it should be prosecuted. There should be no question about that. Anybody who abuses a child should be prosecuted. They're criminals.
Baroness, do you have anything you wanted to add to that issue?
Well, I think it's been the position in Rome for quite a long time that bishops should fully cooperate. But this was raised at the conference in the Gregorian University when a bishop asked Monsignor Scicluna, the promoter of justice at the CDF, how far is a bishop required to cooperate? And he said a bishop is required to fully cooperate with civil authorities. The issue of mandatory reporting is always going to be a contentious one in different countries. In the United Kingdom, we don't have mandatory reporting in the same way that you do in many Australian states. I don't think all do. There are members of the Commission, the Pontifical Commission, who feel very strongly that nothing less than mandatory reporting for the whole world should be introduced. And I think one of the difficulties we're facing is trying to define what is meant by it. And Bill Kilgallen explains, I think, very well how that obligation to cooperate may need to be modified according to the reliability of civil authorities in those countries. And of course, that could be seen as being, a very difficult one. But the Church does expect the church leadership in each country to determine how they work within that country's legal framework.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honour.
Yes, that brings this discussion to an end, but can I thank you all for your contribution. Baroness, I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding about your giving evidence, but we're very glad that you were able to join us today. And as may be apparent from what I've said already, we see the work that you're doing as a very important part of the Church's response, which of course will assist the Church to perhaps come to terms with the recommendations we will make in due course. But can I thank you again and excuse you from further attendance.
Thank you.
We'll adjourn until
2 o'clock today.
2 o'clock. Very well.